Thank you again to our DC Data Summit and Innovator sponsors as well. So at Achievement Network, our mission is to work alongside leadership teams to strengthen their school-wide practice and culture of really using standards and data to drive results for the students that we serve. As we work and engage with leaders in schools, we are focused on both educational equity, but also we are committed as an organization to being an anti-racist org. So the objectives for our session today are to understand 3 guiding principles for establishing a strong assessment system, including diagnostic assessments, learning to use data from diagnostics, and synthesizing information and next steps from series. So as we engage in this, like what I think of as a new season in education, what we know to be true, which like in the past we've, if you've been in education for a while, you know that we've always used diagnostics, but we want to dive into what does this like a strong assessment culture actually look like for your school, and how do you refresh your lens for what we're looking for when we're looking at diagnostics and actually planning for next steps. I am going to give you guys 2 minutes to dive in and actually do some work. So if you will solve these 3 4th grade tasks that relate to the first module in 5th grade math, then we'll go on to the next part of our session. So I'm going to give you guys, once again, 2 minutes to solve these 3 tasks. So these 3 tasks are from a diagnostic that we have, and I'm going to show you how a group of 5th graders did on these 3 questions. If you have experience in this grade band, I would love for you to type into the chat, what do 5th graders that are engaging in Module 1 of Eureka, what do they actually need to come into the year having a foundation in? And what does Module 1 actually cover and address? So if you will type that into the chat. How do 5th graders start the beginning of the year in 5th grade math? So when students are starting in 5th grade, they need to have a strong understanding of decimals, metric, and the measurement conversions. And as we look at the data here from this diagnostic, what would you say students, what information would like these percentages and how students performed on each of these 3 tasks, what information does it provide for us as educators about what students come into 5th grade already knowing? You can just type it into the chat. Right, so if you understand, or if you said that like students are coming in with a pretty strong foundation of place value, and it looks like metric system is not as strong, there's some understanding of decimals, but it's still an area of growth for this particular group of students. So when we think about the work at hand, there's this cycle that I like to think about in terms of we need to understand, diagnose, and take action. I think that like most of our work will be centered on this year, where we're understanding what our kids come to us with, like what are their strengths. We're going to identify or diagnose, like the understanding of the prerequisite skills that students need so that we consider like, what does the entire class need? What does maybe a small group of students need? And then be able to take action from there. Many of you are probably familiar with the opportunity myth, but the main quote that I want to pull forward for you guys is when students who started the year behind grade level had access to stronger instruction, for example, they closed gaps with their peers by 6 months. In classrooms with more grade level appropriate assignments, those gaps closed by more than 7 months. As we think about going into next school year, like what was still true last school year is also true this year, is that all of our students, even those who have fallen behind, should tackle challenging work. As leaders, teachers, and educators, we want to make sure that students have the opportunity to grapple with grade level assignments so that way they are going to not be falling further and further behind because we're trying to account for gaps that they may have had in the past, but instead thinking about what assets do students come with and how do we make sure that we close the gaps as we are teaching grade level content. So why is smart planning so critical to our kids' futures? So this is a model where I think some of us think, I know I've had this conversation a number of times with different leaders, is we're coming in with the thought, well, students missed, quarter 4 of their 4th grade year. So we actually need to stop and drop everything. And we think about like, maybe we need to cover module 4 or module 5, whatever students missed at the end of last year, and then we'll dive into grade level content. But what ends up happening is that at some point, students are going to lose the rest of the 5th grade math content. So I'm gonna go ahead and go through these. You'll have students that say like, I already know how to add and subtract. We learned this at the beginning of last year. Or we were just about to learn decimals when school stopped last year, so now I'm confused. And then at the end of the year, you might have some kids thinking about like how they hope they were gonna learn something in 5th grade, and hopefully that'll be something that they get to catch up on in middle school. And so instead of helping our students, we've actually done more harm than good. So the model that we're gonna talk about today is doing a targeted and just-in-time intervention. So my teacher knew exactly what we needed when we needed it. She has superpowers. That's what we want our students to be thinking. What do you think this model shows at the bottom where it says targeted and just-in-time intervention? What teacher moves need to happen to make this model true? And you can type that into the WOVA app. So that's where we're chatting everything out. But what teacher moves need to be true to make sure that we have targeted and just-in-time intervention? So I'm going to go ahead and dive into what does need to be true for teachers as we think about just-in-time intervention. So this visual is definitely leveraging the coherence of the standards. So we want to get students just enough learning. We're going to give them just enough learning to access Unit 1. These vertical bars are pictures of when we might decide to insert into our instruction an entire module from a previous grade, because it's going to give them access to a current unit. But then what we're also going to do is we're going to layer in quick support into individual lessons or in small groups when students demonstrate a need. So that's the horizontal bar. It may not be an entire module, but it could be just a mini lesson before we actually dive into the grade level content for that day or for that week. And then we're going to continue to use the coherence throughout the year to identify potential barriers, weaving them in limited numbers of extra lessons right before the knowledge is needed. So this is a strategy that it's not just something that's been made up, it's been tested, and Louisiana is actually using it right now. So they brought a group of 2,300 students from 33% proficient to 65% proficient with 1 year of intensive algebra. So they use this just-in-time intervention as a key component of that. I would love to know, have you guys used this technique or a technique like this before? Share your thoughts in the WOVA app and go ahead and just chat and let us know. Have you used a technique like this before? And think about how might this actually look for the students in which you serve. If you're typing into the WOVA app, that's why I'm giving you these like long pauses to make sure that I can see what you're typing into the chat as well. So now that we know we're looking at a targeted and just-in-time intervention, let's dive into objective 1, which is establishing a strong diagnostic assessment system. So something that we talk about at Achievement Network is thinking about when the bridge is up. And so there's a 3-tiered approach to this, but being able to study standards and curriculum to understand the progression of learning, to diagnose students' current knowledge, skills, and understanding, and to take action and provide support to bridge the gap. Today, we're going to focus our work on the diagnosis part, where we're considering what do students know, what are their skills, and what's their understanding. So, one last thing I was going to say about diagnosis, like when we think about diagnosis, there's a broad range and definition for that. We're really thinking about diagnosing where kids are coming in in terms of academic foundational skills and thinking about how that ties into current instruction and the needs of what students will need for Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Module 1, Module 2, and Module 3. So with diagnosis, we are going to determine student understanding of prerequisites based on diagnostic or formative data and consider if gaps exist for the whole class or a small group. So I'm going to give you 3 questions to reflect on here. The first question is, before school closures, how did your school practice diagnosis? So think about what were the tools that you guys used, and when and where were they used? Now think about, how is your school currently practicing diagnosis? So this you might even think about like the conversations that you've had in thinking about how you will assess students as they come into this new school year. And lastly, what priorities around diagnosis are taking shape for you as you think about next year? So this is just a great place to actually stop and jot some of the things that maybe you've started to think about as you think about the diagnostic assessments that your school has previously used, or maybe where there's opportunities to think about how do you want to actually diagnose where students are as you think about the 2021 school year. As we think about diagnosis, we also want to know that we want to strike a balance. So we want to get the information that we need from students, but we also want to balance that with the importance of it not taking up all of our instructional time. Sometimes I know, like when I was in school, there can be this pitfall where we end up assessing or over-assessing our students, and so we're not actually taking action with the data that we're getting. So I would just highlight that for you here, that as you're thinking about diagnosing students, if you're thinking about the number of tests, like be thinking about what's the why behind the test that you're putting in front of students. What's the purpose of the diagnostic in the day in which you're giving it? And we'll talk more about that later, but I would just elevate that right now for you. So ANA has 3 guiding principles for a strong assessment system. It is establishing a tiered approach to collecting data, prioritizing data close to instruction, and using data to increase student and family engagement. In the participant packet, there should have been a white paper document for you guys to read more about strong assessment systems as we go into this next school year. So if you have like an RTI or an MTSS process already, you probably already have an established tiered approach to collecting data. And we're going to think about data for 3 bucket areas. So all, some, or few. So when we think about all students, we want to think about, like, do we have a short diagnostic that focuses on major work of the grade and provides specific information about student strengths and area of need? And then we'll be thinking about, do our students have the necessary prerequisite knowledge to access upcoming grade level content? What specific strengths and areas of need do we need to notice? And then as we think about taking action, we want to consider giving students more time on core academic content as needed and ensure that it's done in a just-in-time approach as opposed to like a blanket review. So once again, elevating the fact that our kids need to be interacting with grade level core academic content. And it needs to be all of our students, not just some of our students or a few of our students. And then after we've assessed all of our students, it may lead us to want to find out more information about subsets of students so that we're thinking about, okay, well, there may be some additional gaps that we're not sure how to actually, like, how do we address this outside of tier 1 instruction? So for some of our students, diagnostic results may indicate, like I said, that that they were furthest from grade level standards. And so we might want to do an additional foundational diagnostic for them. We'll be asking ourselves the question, are there foundational skills that we need to be aware of? What targeted instructional resources can we provide? And this is where we will think about how can we leverage interventionists, math interventionists, to support building foundational skills. And then there will be fewer students that fall into this last bucket. So I'm going to give you a second just to digest this. So as we think about establishing a tiered approach to collecting data, we want to call out an equity alert here where students may fall into a bucket where they're tracked or they're over tested. So as you think about this, We want to make sure that we have a commitment to and an understanding of equitable instruction, and acknowledging that like racism and bias can show up in the classroom. And as we look at the information from assessments, we want to make sure that we're using it in a way that doesn't actually magnify existing issues. So we don't want data to serve as the gatekeeper for whether or not a student gets to engage in grade level content. Once again, that will, it wouldn't yield to equitable instruction, equitable practices. So just as you think about re-engaging in this school year, how can you put things into place so that that way you don't increase a system that can be inequitable. So just take a moment and jot down, how can you strengthen your tiered approach to increase equity? And this should be in your note catcher, your participant guide. Part 2 is to prioritize data that's close to instruction. So sometimes we prioritize data that's pretty and it rolls up really nicely, or it's just something that we've always done before. But what we really want to be considering is, can a teacher use this next week? If not, then we need to consider whether the assessment is worth giving. So I would say that just because we've done it before in the past, this is a great time before we start this next school year to think about, why are we using this assessment? And is this an assessment that teachers can actually use next week to inform their instruction? So data sources that are close to instruction can be the curriculum embedded assessments. It could be in-lesson check for understandings and exit tickets. And then if you're an ANET partner, we also have diagnostics that we have just started this year, so you can actually use them to inform how you want to think about instruction in several intervals throughout the year. In the chat, in just a moment, there's a model for diagnostics and just-in-time support and intervention. I'm going to give you guys about 5 minutes. And so one of my ANET colleagues will chat out. This is a tool from the LDOE, which has a remediation tool. So you can dive into, there's a number of different buckets when you get the link, but there's one bucket that says remediation tool. I'm gonna give you 5 minutes to dive into a grade that is a grade that you support, a grade that you teach, and look at the remediation tool for that grade.
And Kina, this is Allie. If folks are looking for the link, we just put it in the Whova chat. There's a link to it there. If you're in the participant packet, the link for the LDOE website is also located towards the bottom of page 2. So you can get to it through either one of those places. And you'll look on the right hand, once you get to the website, look on the right hand side to where it says Tier 1 remediation tools.
And I should also name that it is specific to the Eureka math curriculum. A lot of the other curriculum that I know schools are using have also started to push some different remediation tools. But whether you use Eureka math or not, I think that you can look at this and see exactly how they're thinking about that just-in-time instruction and what are the implications for the curriculum in which you're using at your school. In the WOVA app, I would love to hear, how could a tool like this support students' access to grade level math? So if you will type in the WOVA app and just let me know, how could a tool like this support students' access to grade level math? So I see Maria's talking about their teaching will be targeted based on the diagnostics made by teachers and differentiated based on students' needs, student-specific needs. And someone asked about this being tied to Common Core standards. It is tied to Common Core standards. And I think as we think about this tool and we think about the importance of having a knowledge of the standards, even as we look at the example on the screen, it tells you, exactly what might be the misunderstanding that a student might have. So we're not just looking at something as right or wrong, but really looking at like, what's the gap as it's connected to the standard? Because if you've looked at the coherence map and you're reading the standards, you're pulling out like, what are the key things that students need to be able to know? What's the conceptual understanding that's present there? Or is there some level of fluency or application? And so we're going to be able to actually drill down, even when thinking about that just-in-time instruction. But what's that one thing? What's that one question that you may even need to ask a student, instead of just thinking it as a very black-white, right or wrong? So lastly in this is we want to be thinking about using data to increase family and student engagement. Oftentimes when we're thinking about data, we're thinking about like, how do we use it to group students, or we're giving kids a grade, but really thinking about how do we use this data to maintain both like student and parent and family engagement. So it says, what we need now is data that does two things. It gives families a line of sight into how their students are doing relative to grade level content. And then two, gives teachers a line of sight into how they can support students instructionally so they can be successful with grade level content. So when we think about elements of strong feedback when it comes to using data, whether that's diagnostic or our, check for understanding, or thinking about module aligned assessments, we want to engage in feedback that's both timely, specific, consistent, and engaging. So which element of strong feedback do you want to prioritize to increase student and family engagement? If you will tell me in the WOVA app, in the chat box, that would be great. So as we think about how you want to use diagnostic data, how you want to use check for understanding, exit tickets, assessments, whether they're formative or not. This is an example of kind of a year-long data review map. So we might have something that's like the beginning of the year for all students, and then we'll have a quarterly process check for all students. And then you'll see within here, there's like some monthly data reviews that might have a particular focus. Maybe when you identified a subset of students from like your beginning of the year diagnostic data, you decided that there were some other students that you wanted to check in on along the way to see that they're actually making progress towards the goal, and the goal being that they're able to access grade level content and that we're closing those gaps for them. So they're building the knowledge and understanding that they need for the current year, but then also being able to progress into next year as well. And the purple at the very bottom is like those weekly data reviews that may be for just a small subset of students that needed additional support. And if you are an ANET partner, or you've considered being an ANET partner, this is, we have a new suite of assessments coming up this year. And so we are including with our assessment suite that we have diagnostic assessments in both ELA and math, along with a new version of assessments throughout the year that are abbreviated. They're still focused on the standards, but they are shorter in length. And then you also have some ongoing assessment tools that are accessible via our quiz tool. So as you think about your own assessment strategies, what ideas about assessment strategy are taking shape for you as you think about your role? So I know that there are a number of you that are in different seats at the schools that you're in, but what ideas are you taking away or even starting to think about as you think about your assessment strategy for this upcoming year? If you will type that into the chat. So I hear someone in the chat was talking about incorporating additional layers of support. If there are no other comments, I'm going to go ahead and pass this over to Allie.
Great. Thanks, Kina. And thanks to those of you who've been using the HOVA chat here. I know we're trying to go back and forth and trying to answer questions as they're coming in, respond to thoughts and reactions. I just put a note in the chat to say I think we've been staying kind of at this high level to say what are some best practices for how to think about assessment strategy as we look at the year ahead. And we're about to get into the weeds a little bit to think about what does this actually look like at the start of the year? What can instructional leaders and teachers be doing now with their curriculum and knowledge of the standards? And what are the systems and structures we can put in place once the school year gets started to really make sure we're supporting that sort of just-in-time approach to teaching? So as you're wrapping up, any of your last reflections from that first section, I want to give kind of everybody fair warning that in this section, we're really going to be diving into some math and standards and do the math ourselves so we can begin to think about what this will look like and feel like. And as Kina mentioned, we recognize that people are maybe entering this conversation from different seats and roles at schools. And so as we dive into the standards, I just invite you all to lean in, even if it may feel uncomfortable at times. We know that the best learning comes from some of that discomfort. And so this is kind of my favorite part of sections when we actually get to dive in and do the math. So I'm excited to do that with you all right now. So with that being said, Kina, can you go ahead and move the slide for me? So we talked about this visual earlier, these three components that are really critical to address for addressing instructional recovery. And I just want to acknowledge that the path across and within these may not be totally linear. We're going to jump into the diagnose portion right now, and we're going to be looking at some sample data sets and thinking about how we might apply those. But there might be times when we have to back up a bit to really build our understanding of the standards, and then we move forward again to taking action. And so the process of moving throughout these stages is just going to be something to be cognizant of. You're never going to be done building understanding of the standards. Diagnosis isn't something that should just happen at the start of the year. And so I just want to name that even within the course of this section, we're going to kind of be moving throughout these pieces as we dive in, and that's what it should feel like throughout the entire school year. Okay, so the scenario that you see here up on the screen, this is the scenario that we're going to imagine and kind of work through a model with right now. And so really quickly, I want us to imagine that we're all fifth grade teachers or supporting fifth grade teachers. And you're really thinking about how to help your students prepare for the first module of fifth grade math in the fall. Some of the work that's happened before this conversation, before you've had any diagnostic data, is there's work to begin to anticipate the places where unfinished learning could have had the greatest impact on beginning of year content. So if you are at a school where you were at this spring, you can know either through talking with teachers or from being one yourself, how much content was covered, how much content did we get through this spring, even when buildings closed in March. What was accomplished with students through distance learning. And as Keena mentioned, a lot of curricula companies, especially those with a high quality curriculum, have begun sharing guidance similar to what you see on this slide. This is actually an example of a tool that our team created to support schools using the Eureka Math curriculum. But basically, it's showing you that if I'm a fifth grade teacher, here are some of the things that I should consider when I enter the start of the year. I know that if students who are rising fifth graders, meaning they were fourth graders in the spring, they may have some unfinished learning with decimals because operations with decimals is something that often gets covered in the late spring months. And so we can't just assume that students are coming in with all of that decimal knowledge. And this is actually a place where before we can continue with the fifth grade content, we really need to make sure that students are strong, have some strong content knowledge and conceptual understanding of decimals so that they can tackle the grade level content in module 1. And so you can see on here, the recommendation is that we actually would suggest building in some time to first diagnose and tackle that fourth grade content to make sure that we can move on. We also know that students might have missed some fourth grade instruction around measurement conversions. And based upon our connections and using the vertical coherence maps of standards, we've hypothesized that we can actually address some of that work with measurement conversions within the existing fifth grade lessons instead of pausing grade level instruction. So these are some of the decision points that we'll have to make. And again, this is some of the work that happened before we even have any diagnostic data. So Keena, if you could go to the next slide for us. So this is part of the understanding stage. And what I would love to give us all the chance to do is take a moment to read what's on the screen. There are 3 grade level standards on the screen, 2 fourth grade measurement standards, and 1 fifth grade measurement standard. And the questions I would love for you to be thinking to yourself about are, what is it that those 4 MD standards really require of students? So what do students learn in 4th grade? And what's the next step they'll need to take to really be able to tackle that 5th grade MD standard? So I'm just going to give us a moment, read the language of the standards, think to yourself, how would you describe the jump from 4th grade to 5th grade? Once you've had a chance to do that, I would love it if you could put your reflections in the chat. There's not one right answer here. There are several connections we could make. So I'd love to just give you a moment to think for yourself. And when you're ready, would love to have you put that in the chat. depending upon your familiarity with the 4th grade and 5th grade standards, this might take a little bit more time. Again, I would reiterate and underscore the need that it takes to do this work to really build understanding of the standards. As you were reading those, a couple of things you may have noticed. One, in 4th grade, students are first learning how to convert measurements, and really only from going from larger units to smaller units. By the time students enter 5th grade, they really need to convert in both directions, which really draws on more extensive knowledge with concepts like division, fractions, decimals. And we've also seen this added element of multi-step problems. And so we can begin to build this knowledge now, again, without having any sort of diagnostic data. And then we can begin to say, so what do we do with that information? So if you go to the next slide, Kina. One recommendation we made, again, without having any data yet, but just knowing some context for how standards are connected and knowing what content may or may not have been covered from the spring, we made a couple of lesson modifications. And if you're interested, the links to the resources that we're going to be talking about are in the participant packet. They're also in the slides that you should have access to via the Whova app. So first, when we looked at the lessons in this first module for 5th grade, we saw that lesson 4 is the first lesson where this 5MD1 standard is addressed. And you can see this is the task that's on the right-hand side of your screen, where it's really an application problem that is asking students to jump into describing fractions of a meter. And so we know in looking at this task in the curriculum that if students haven't been fully exposed to conversions within the metric system in 4th grade, this part might be confusing to them. So then we went back and said, well, what's my entry point for this standard? And the prior grades, module 6 was a good place to start. There's a lesson in grade 4, module 6 that seems very connected to this lesson. And that's where you'll see one of the activities from that 4th grade lesson is on the left-hand side. It's just some concrete activities that can really build students' understanding of fractions of a meter. And since students are already working with the meter stick manipulative in the 5th grade lesson, a task like this could be really helpful to discuss at the outset of a lesson. So this is meant to be a super quick entry point to get to the lesson, and it's designed to get students to grade level work as much as possible. Without any sort of diagnostic data, this is really as far as we can go, knowing that we may not have that sort of data until the fall when students come back. So this is the step where we're actually going to pick up today. And again, I just want to underscore that getting to this step requires a whole bunch of work. It's like a whole nother session and planning time that we would suggest taking. I just walked through that thinking that's really built into the understand part so that we can begin to think about how to apply data in this context. So at the start of this session, we looked at some of these data points that now you see on the screen. These were actually tasks from the LDOE remediation guides that we took a look at a little while ago. And so if you're the teacher for this class, and this is the data for your incoming 5th graders, what additional information would you need from student work to be able to use in instructing this lesson within the next few days? So I'll give you a second to look at this. And what you might be thinking is this quantitative data is, while helpful, there's probably more information we can do to actually understand what strategies did kids use? What misconceptions did their student work reveal? Were there common trends in incorrect answers? So now you can see on this next slide, we're just going to start layering in some pieces. And again, if 4th grade math is 4th or 5th grade math is not your area of specialty, feel free to put in the chat any questions that you have. But I'm just going to walk through and talk through some of these layers of information so that we can begin to think about how we'd apply diagnostic data in this scenario. So what you'll now see here on the screen is we've put the actual standards that these items and tasks were tagged to. You can see the corresponding Eureka modules that these lessons were tied to. And you can also see some qualitative information from student work. So I'm going to pause here and just give us all the chance to look at some of the information that's included here on this screen. And then I'm going to talk through some of the ideas that our team came to when we were looking at this diagnostic set of data. And again, if you have any questions, wonderings, insights as you're looking at this, feel free to put those in the chat. If you have questions, feel free to use the Q&A function in the Whova app. I'm going to try something a little bit different here, you all. If you have any insights coming out of this data, go ahead and try to take yourself off of mute and share what these additional layers of information are making you think. What else did you learn with the information about the qualitative student work piece? We'll see how this goes, you all. With 30 people coming off of mute can feel dangerous, but I think we could do it. I'd love to hear some thoughts from people.
You can always come off mute and then Allie can say, okay, this person.
And the question was just what new understanding about this group of students has been illuminated now that we can see some of the information from the qualitative results, the trends in what percentage of students used what place value strategies, where some of the common trends were. So the question again, what new understanding about this group of students has been illuminated for you? Maria, I know you asked that question in the chat. With that question being repeated, do you have any initial thoughts? Okay, well, I'm going to be cognizant of time here. And if you do want to come off of chat or come off of mute and it feels hard to do so or you're having trouble, please put that in the chat so we can make sure that you all are actually able to do that. A couple of things our team has been thinking about, actually, if you could just go back, Kina. One of the strengths that were noted earlier when we initially looked at this data set was students seem to have some strengths with their place value understanding. A question that we would have here is, while 70% of students answered this question correctly, half of those students who got this question right drew a place value chart. So that's great to know that that's the strategy students are relying on, because we ourselves probably didn't have to use a place value chart to solve this problem. And so this is a real strength that we can build on. Students are drawing on a concrete strategy from a prior grade to get at the more conceptual knowledge, but that's information that we didn't know until we actually looked at the student work to see what strategies they were using. With the decimals, being able to know kind of that half of, or 5 students incorrectly wrote 8.100 as an answer and 9 wrote 8/10. This is suggesting that some students are halfway there, right? With an answer of 8/10, they're beginning to at least show conceptual understanding of the concept of a decimal as a fraction of a whole. But there are still some students who are probably more confused with that answer of 8 and some when being asked to reply to the idea of a decimal form of the fraction 8/100. And so that might be a place where those students might really benefit from small group work. And then lastly, with the conversion and measurement tables, it does seem like students are really struggling with those. And we look at the pure quantitative numbers. We can look at this and say, okay, well, students definitely don't have all of the conversions memorized, but they also don't need to. And so that might make us think a little bit more about how can we support students with the anchor charts of conversions and then giving them opportunities to really show what they know in the module. The student work that's shown here is typical of the whole class. And so this is a really great example of someone who's ready to access grade level content when given a conversion chart, but who may need some additional practice in really pulling that prior knowledge to the forefront. And so these are some of the ways that we can use this idea of a diagnosis step to further inform what instructional recovery should look like. It probably feels like a lot of work right now. And it's helpful to remember that we just don't always have to start from scratch. There's some work we can be doing now that then we can gut check later on. So with that, Kina, if you could go to the next slide now. The other thing just to remember, and you can animate this slide with a few boxes here, there we go. It's definitely helpful if I'm a school leader, if I'm a teacher, doing that practice that we just did is really helpful for building my muscles around data analysis and doing that exercise like we just did on the previous slide to kind of layer in what does the quantitative data tell us, what does the qualitative data tell us. And remember that if you use tools like the ones we looked at earlier from the LDOE, those remediation tools, some tools like that already have done a lot of this thinking for us. So it doesn't, again, have to be totally from scratch. Here's what you see on this slide right now, what's in the purple font in the boxes. This is what the remediation tool had to say about these particular tasks, things to look out for, insights to anticipate. And so you can, again, use these tools to really support your understanding of what you might see from students. So with that being said, let's go to the next slide now. And we're going to go back to the model that we started with and begin to say, what do you now think about this lesson modification? If the task on the right with those fractions of meter sticks are what a 5th grade teacher would be doing at the start of the year, does it still make sense to use that application problem from a 4th grade module as an entry point for students? Since making this lesson plan modification, we now have some diagnosis data, we have access to student work. And one recommendation we would make is to say, yeah, this lesson uses a place value chart. This is a really good entry point that can build on students' strengths because we know so many students are using a place value chart to show their understanding of the place value concepts. So this is something we might need to use, especially at the start, because after we get into some new concept development within the lesson, that place value chart goes away. So from our sense, it still does make sense to start with this task, use it as an opportunity to create a place value anchor chart together that then students have to refer to as you continue to move on with grade level content.